Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Dr. Eric Helms back on the podcast, and I believe, man, I just had this pulled up. I know it was back in January episode. Come on, load up for me here. Either way, Eric, glad you're back on. I'm going to find this episode here. But yeah, thanks for coming back on. Always good to chat. I know it was in January. It's June now, so a few months ago at this point. So I guess we can start out. How have things been on your end? Anything big in the last few months or anything like that on your end?
No, man, I appreciate being back on. Always a great time talking to you. And when we were talking in January, I was pretty much fully done with the my post 2023 season recovery and moving into the official recover like off-season phase post recovery. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, hopeful. And the big update is that my off-season has been going remarkably well,
Good.
which I really can't complain about. Yeah, other big updates is I've had a few students finish their PhDs, which is cool. New research coming out, mass is progressing, working on the third edition of the pyramids, and yeah, just it's a good time. I can't complain.
Awesome. And hey, we're probably going to dive into pretty much all those things that you just talked about. So that's a perfect segue. So I guess first, training. Yeah. I know last time. So episode 387. So if anybody wants to go back and look, 387, one of the titles was prep review. So you're reviewing your prep. And I think you did start talking about your beginning of your off season at that point. So fill me in. How's that been going? You said it's been progressing pretty well. Anything that's been working well or anything like that, or anything that you've been doing differently that's been working?
Yeah, I think I talked about the high level approach. This is a recap for anyone who hasn't listened to that episode or doesn't plan to go back. Historically, I've been a dual, if not quadruple sport athlete. But generally, I think a good way to put it is I've been is equally interested in strength sport as I have been in bodybuilding. But in terms of just like how am I built? I'm moderately strong compared to other power lifters, but certainly not competitive. But I'm a little prettier than your average lifter. My ceiling seems to be a lot higher in terms of actual competitiveness in bodybuilding. So I made the decision to go all in and push my chips over to hypertrophy training. And this is the first time in my 20-year history of training, at my 20-year anniversary just last month,
Congrats.
where thank you, where I've exclusively trained for bodybuilding. It's always been juggling, strength sport, mostly powerlifting, but also weightlifting and strongman. So that in and of itself has really allowed me a lot more ability to push higher volumes, closer to failure, and have more focused exercise selection and technique, which I think have all made a big contribution to having an effective off season. This is probably the leanest I've ever been at where I'm sitting right now, which is just under 200 pounds, like 89 and a half for the non-Americans. So that's great. I had an ISAC, which is just a really high level anthropometry assessment done by one of my colleagues back in, I want to say that was either March or April. And I was blown away by my sum of eight skin folds because they were pretty similar. They're like maybe 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters in total across eight sites, higher than when I was in contest prep 8 weeks out from my first show, but at a body weight where I am like 4 or 5 kilos heavier. So it was really good to see that because my mind was playing tricks on me. My body weight was higher than I had wanted it at the point I was in the off season, and I'm starting to see it slow down a little bit. But I definitely had some kind of not newbie gains, but I had a growth spurt being able to shift all my energy towards bodybuilding and being able to recover from higher volumes, training closer to failure, and just doing a lot of work that is more specific to bodybuilding. It's been very successful, and it's pretty cool. I've got another 6 months before I'm even considering maybe got a mini cut coming up in November, depending upon how things are looking and what my collaborative coach Brian Miner here at 3DMJ thinks, and we'll go from there. But I've got a lot of runway left before I got to start dieting for 2025.
Yeah. And with that, are you just going to continue to try to push your weight up? Or are you just going to continue with the slow weight gain? Or is that something where you'll maybe see it level off? Or yeah, what's that going to look like for you?
Yeah, we have a top end rough goal of about like 91, 92 kilos. So just a touch over 200 pounds. And I think that will tell us where we're at. We want to start prep, even like around here would be fine. Like my current body composition is a really great place to start prep. And if I was to think about what I looked like at the start of this last prep versus how much I lost, my stage weight's probably up a couple kilos. So we're planning for that, which I generally don't recommend, but it's just wild to think that I've already made that kind of progress. So it's encouraging. So the game plan is steady, slow weight gain for the Americans, another 4 pounds over the next 5 months is what we're aiming for, 4 or 5 pounds. So Not certainly not a bulk, but certainly not like just straight up gaintaining.
Is that kind of just based off the obviously the research paper you had and stuff like that in terms of kind of that slow approach, or is that something that again you found to work best just for yourself?
I think it's what makes the most sense at higher levels of training. The really interesting thing is that where I set my calories after the recovery phase and then how much weight I gained, the math doesn't really make sense. And I think a really cool way to look at this is that the energy content of muscle is actually much lower per unit of mass because it's mostly water and then it's contractile tissue. And if you just think about 9 calories per gram of fat, 4 calories per gram of protein, that is also true when we're talking about actual proteins and fats in our body. But then adipose tissue is only like 10% fluids and muscle is a much higher fluid composition. So when your newbies typically see precipitous weight gain that doesn't really match up with the expected surplus if we are locked in our old school 3,500 calorie rule. And considering how lean my gains have been, it makes sense that my small surplus produced a large weight gain, but it's mostly composed of muscle mass. So the fact that it's slowing down now means I might be out of that super nice growth spurt honeymoon phase, but I'm still doing hard work. I am still seeing progress both in the gym and even physically, just looking in the mirror, but it's slowed down a bit. So I'm riding that pace out. So it's to make sure that I'm not gaining unnecessary body fat when I have to get back on stage shredded.
Yeah, and I guess you attribute that to just being more specific and more just towards bodybuilding and everything, seeing that, like you said, almost to where it doesn't make sense from like a weight gain perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like this is an issue that won't affect 95% of lifters, but I got to a point in my career as both a power lifter and a bodybuilder where to do what I needed to do to progress in either one and not just maintain was requiring a level of work that was making the other challenging. So needing to do a single every week on the squat and deadlift and 2 singles per week on the bench just to hold the line on my powerlifting strength. It doesn't sound like it's much, but considering what I have seen that I need to do to progress in terms of hypertrophy at an optimal rate, it does start to sap your recovery resources. And I unfortunately am not a responder to low volume. I train most of my sets close to failure, and I'm also doing more volume than most. So there's just not a lot of extra room, especially with my schedule, to be like, yeah, let me just work up to a 240 kilo deadlift single. That takes that 15 minutes and that a bit of fatigue is enough to where I'm like, oh God damn it, I gotta do RDLs now. So it can be I think what I would attribute it to is more targeted exercise selection, training closer to failure, and doing more volume, and then not having to do exercises that have as much what the kids would say a higher fatigue to stimulus ratio. But really, a lot of it's just orthopedic concerns too. I can only take so much squat, benching, and deadlifting. And when I want to progress in powerlifting, it is like a 5 to 6 day per week training each of the big lifts every day on bench, up to 3 times a week on squat, and up to 2 times a week on deadlift, and then doing some back off work. If I wanted to say take a run at competing at Masters Worlds, for example, and trying to actually win or place top 3 at New Zealand Masters Nationals right now, it would be probably an 8 to 10 hour per week training commitment with the kind of rest periods you need. And I'd like, and then you just sneak in some bicep curls and calf raises and leg curls. And I could do that, but I'm a little more interested in trying to place top 5 in the professional open middleweight division and WNBF world than I am placing like 15th in Masters IPF worlds. If I can even beat the other badass masters in New Zealand, and there's a few.
Yeah. So again, it's again figuring out what's most important to you. That's obviously super important. But I guess for you then to talk about the specificity of training, I guess if somebody was like wondering okay, so how come I can't? Is it again just a volume thing? Is it just maybe more individual where some people potentially could see some pretty good gains from like kind of doing that's what you were talking about? Because I know you said you do a lot better with higher volume. So is it more individual, or what kind of is the big thing there to where you wouldn't be able to do these, throw in the big lifts like that and try to progress from a powerlifting standpoint as well too?
I think it's 3 big things. So the first one is how close to my ceiling am I as a powerlifter and a bodybuilder? And the closer you get, the harder it is to make progress and the slower it is. So you have to invest in what is a relatively shitty ROI. You have to do harder work or more work. And that comes back to the second big thing, which is, do you tend to need higher or lower volumes? We had a really great discussion, myself and Jeff Alberts, where we reflected on this, because the most common question he gets on his 3DMJ vlog of his off-season training, and anytime he does a vlog, and he has got this question the last 15 years of doing 3DMJ, is why do you do so little volume? Wouldn't you do better if you did more? And when I share my training, I'm not like extreme volume as people might see out there, but especially compared to Jeff, I look like I'm on very high volume. So we're talking high 20s for sets on chest, close to 30 sets on back. And then if you count direct and indirect work, so all of my pressing and all of my pulling, I'm in the 30 or 40s for my arms. And then my legs are between 15 to 20 sets, depending upon the muscle group, right? Not astronomical, but certainly on the like a standard deviation or two, especially for my upper body compared to what most people do. And the way people see it is that Jeff and I must have two totally different training philosophies, right? And the reality is that's not the case. We have identical training philosophies in that we focus on what works because we're coaches. And they have our training processes, which is where we start with relatively low volume, focus on intensity and quality, and then adjust volume as needed to see progress or to adjust for recovery, has led to two different outcomes. Where if I did what Jeff did, it would be hard in the session, but I'd be fine within 24 hours. And if he did what I did, it would really put him in the recovery hole and without necessarily giving him a faster benefit. And I've seen 4 repeated experiments on myself over the 20 years I've been training where I've tried to manipulate everything else except volume. And when I finally do manipulate volume, especially in my upper body, I make progress. I wish it wasn't that way. That's why I've done 4 experiments, but it is. I know that's hard for some people to digest if they themselves are low volume responders, if they come from a lower volume, higher intensity, dogmatic perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And then some other people, it's the opposite with Jeff. So anyway, we had a really good discussion on the Team 3DMJ YouTube channel. If anyone wants to dig into that and see how to discern whether you respond better to higher or lower volumes. And if I was a low volume responder and also could handle fatigue quite well and just didn't benefit from doing more, maybe there is a world where I could be a dual strength athlete. But I'm also 6 feet tall. I've also been training for 20 years. So I don't think it's so much that I'm 41, but more so that I have a lot of years of training under my belt. So there are certain things that orthopedically I know are bottlenecks and I have to be careful about them and proactive. And like I said, this has only been an issue for me lately. Like I was progressing and I got to this point training as a dual sport athlete. So I think, like I said, 95% of people who lift will never need to be concerned about this. And I've even vocally spoken out against people who have claimed power building is inefficient or bad. Yeah, hypothetically, you could get to a point where one bottlenecks the other. But that's really a concern only of people who are near tapping out their potential for both or for either one of the two. So the big things are 1, I'm near the top of my potential in both. 2, I unfortunately seem to respond and need higher volumes for certain lifts at least, like my bench. And then 3, the big thing is just comes down to orthopedic history. So what can you do and what is your build? So if you're 5'6", you've got short arms, short femurs, not a long torso, and you've got a nice resilient skeleton, you're not easily injured. The cost of using squat, bench, and deadlift as your vehicles for hypertrophy is just not that high, right? So you can have those Venn diagrams cross a little bit more, but that is an individual thing. So I think those are the big 3 pieces as to why, for me, this is the kind of the way I need to approach it.
Yeah. And so it sounds like it's, I guess with that too, you kind of mentioned like you could make great progress doing like power building and stuff like that. But I'm assuming too, within that, it's also, hey, if you really want to maximize either one, the best route's probably always going to be to try to be as specific as possible. But if you want it both, it's like, you can definitely do it. And it's probably not going to be a concern until you really get to these kind of, like you said, higher, you're more advanced and whatnot at that point.
Yeah. It comes down to when do the constraints matter? If you really drilled me down, I could say, yeah, it would be more optimal for anyone to have a pure hypertrophy approach than a strength approach. But the reality is that even through your early intermediate stages, you can max out the stimulus so easy before you even reach what are the limits of what you can recover from. People talk about deloads. And if you're training 3 days per week, like you're taking a deload every other day, like it just may not ever be an issue. The concept of a deload is something that is built into, like you're training 3 hours out of the 24 times 7 hours per week. Do you really think you need a whole week of training where you reduce your volume by 50%? Are you pushing your recovery capacities that much? Probably not. And maybe when you're training 1 to 2 hours, 5 days per week, and you're pushing everything to failure, sure, and you'll know it. Or if you're doing heavy powerlifting training and you're orthopedically taking a beating, you might need some time away or some adjustments to reduce load, et cetera. But I think the hypothetical argument of what is optimal only matters when the constraints require optimality to make progress. And that's simply not going to be the case for 95% of people. And power building can be just as effective. You're literally giving nothing up. You might just feel a little more tired, a little more beat up, but it's not actually preventing you from reaching the same level of outcome until you have to line up every single one of your ducks and get those ducks in a row to make progress at all, which is somewhere where I'm close enough to that it's a consideration, but is not where 95% of people are.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. To follow up on that too, you mentioned that you respond well to higher volumes. Is that just again going to be more of a genetic type thing, and there are responders to that? And then on top of it, is it also maybe like could it potentially be like a preference thing where it's you just find that to be a little bit more enjoyable? And then with Jeff, he may just find that like that lower volume approach is just more enjoyable, allows him to stick to it. I'm assuming that goes into it. And then, like you said, obviously like your limbs and like orthopedics and stuff like that's going to play a big role in that. But I guess really my question is, would you say it's probably more genetic versus like preference than anything there with that?
Man, uncovering individual response is so hard. From a research perspective, you have to determine multiple sources of variation. And I won't be too much of a statistics nerd here. So there's a couple ways you can do this in terms of designs. You can do a crossover. So the same person does two different things at different times. So you do a high volume protocol for 8 weeks. You do habitual training for 8 weeks to quote unquote wash out the differences. And then you do 8 weeks of low volume. The problem is that you don't respond the same way to the same program. And everyone who's been lifting long enough knows this. And that could be due to completely non-genetic factors, environmental constraints, or order effects. So you can start everybody on opposite orders and randomize which one they do first, and you can get around that. But the variation within you needs to be controlled for. Okay, well, I got a solution to that. We can do it within subject's design. Your left leg does one protocol, your right leg does the other. But there is still going to be some random variation there. So what you really have to do is like a within subjects design crossover and then repeat the whole thing. So it is this like massive issue. And there's some great work that has come out of James Steele, his lab, and also is going to come out of FAU under newly minted Dr. Zach Robinson from Data Driven Strength. But it's very hard to observe some of these things. And the time courses, the time scales, they're challenging. When we have tried to pick apart and explain the variance in people who respond more or less, for one, there's the issue of, are you actually a high responder or a low responder, or did you just happen to respond high or low in this protocol at this time? And if we just pretend that's not an issue, and we just go right to how do we predict that variance, there's some studies where you've looked at mRNA transcription rates, which is a proxy for ribosome biogenesis, which is the cellular machinery of how much protein you make. We've looked at fiber typing. We've looked at nutritional status. We've looked at hormone levels. We being quote unquote big sports science, right? There are some studies that have looked at a ton of different molecular and practical level predictors, and it explains at most like 10% of the variance. So we don't have a good way to prospectively predict who will and won't respond well to training. And we don't even have good evidence to show that there is in such a thing as individual response, to spoil the plot a little bit from Zach's. Now, just because you don't observe it in a study doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's hard to pin down and isolate. And you're limited by the study protocol. How many people who are semi-outliers are you going to get from a random sample? If you were to randomly sample a bunch of resistance-trained athletes, you would be forced to conclude that there's no such thing as a professional athlete because you're unlikely to get one of them. So you're not going to get the high and low responders necessarily who are really conscious about this. You also then have to observe them for a long period of time. And then you have to actually explore the ranges of volume or whatever variable you're interested in terms of response that might be what is ideal for an individual. And if you're in and around 2/3 of their habitual training volume, it may not be enough to pick out the signal from the noise. So all of those factors make it very challenging from an empirical perspective. So as a sports scientist, all I can say is I don't know. It's some combination of environmental, individual, and personality factors. From an experiential perspective, as Eric Helms, the athlete, and Eric Helms, the coach and trainer, I will tell you that personality can play a big role and what people will want to do, and therefore what level of effort they will put into it and their belief in it, the whole expectation placebo effects. But I do think there are intrinsic factors related to some people who seem to respond better to one versus the other. The really interesting thing about me is that my lower body responds differently to my upper body. And I think that's at least an argument for going, it's probably not my personal preferences or my personality. If I just love doing high volume, but each time I try high volume, my upper body responds and my lower body seems to respond about the same as far as I can tell. And I'm not just someone who hates squats. Like I've clearly been a strength athlete for too long and not just the guy who skips leg day. I don't actually love high volume training. I love being in the gym, but if you ask me on my fourth set of leg press, would you prefer to have 3 or 2 sets of leg press? I'd be like, absolutely. I think if I was to go purely with what does my personality like, it would be a high frequency, low volume protocol. So where I'm training in the gym every day for 45 minutes. And I've actually done that and I've made it work for that, where I've tried to marry up my personal preferences with what is like what will work. And that has worked great at times, but I just don't have the schedule that allows me to be in the gym daily. Most people don't. And in some cases, I have a block of time that needs to be dedicated to a given exercise. Like it's very difficult to get through an SBD day in 45 minutes,
Right.
unless it's a single at a 7 on all three, and then you just go home. For me, it's not a personality thing. I like training, but I don't necessarily like training with a ton of volume. I also enjoy training to and past failure. Like when I first started training, I was doing forced reps and I was influenced. I watched Blood and Guts from Dorian Yates, and I tried Max OT, which is I'm dating myself if people are not aware of these. But basically, I was in a slightly more high intensity, lower volume camp. And I even got to train with Jeff, and he taught me how to do HIIT for a year. And that's when I really saw that it wasn't working well for my upper body, even though it was working well for my lower body. So it's despite my personality, I've landed upon this in many ways. So I think it's probably intrinsic factors related to me. And that's also been what I've observed as a primary thing that seems to be the case for the athletes I've worked with, that it's nice when their personality lines up with that, but it doesn't always. But yeah, it's a tough thing to say, man. I think we're still just barely scratching the surface of this. But as a coach, the process is just isolate a variable as much as you can, rinse and repeat, talk to them, get insights, and try to fast track that experimental process as much as you can so it doesn't take like 8 years like it did for me.
This kind of conversation makes me wonder where if I've been maybe a little too because with hypertrophy, people want like that, hey, this is exactly what you need to do. And like my kind of what I say in my content and stuff is, hey, we have a lot of tools that we can use in the toolbox, but which is true. What you're saying here is there's still probably going to be people that kind of fall on somewhere on the spectrum there in terms of what works best for them. So it's how lenient do we want to be with in terms of, hey, we have a ton of tools here. You have this large rep range. So it's how lenient do you want to be with like your content and how to interpret that? Because it's for you, obviously it's both, right? Lower body maybe responds a little bit better to maybe a little bit, or at least it did at one point, but now your upper body, you need a little bit more volume. So it's like kind of trial and error and figuring out. So just making me wonder if maybe I shouldn't be as lenient with it or there with that.
I think it comes down to messaging. One thing we tried to explain in that video, Jeff and I, is the difference between coaching and practical recommendations that I might put in my books, for example. In my books, I'm going to report the averages that most people seem to respond best to, so that I'm serving the 2/3 of people and I'm giving them the best chance at being somewhere within the realm or close to optimal. For coaching, what you need is a system to be able to explore where someone is. So you might start at the low end of that quote unquote optimal range. Hey, I want you to do 8 to 12 sets per muscle group as our baseline. And then we see what happens, how you respond, what you like, and where is the bottleneck if we are plateaued. Is it because you're over or under recovered? Are there things in place, et cetera? So where people get hung up is not understanding the difference between these two things. A system to make changes based upon outcomes that you're observing, built-in auto-regulation, or just i.e. good coaching, is one thing. And then telling people where should you start and then adjust from there is another. So you might start with a certain number of sets at the beginning and then adjust from there. But people struggle with the difference between a systematic approach to figure out what's best for you and then general recommendations. And one thing I'm really trying to do a better job of is explaining, yes, on average, this is where most people will probably fall. When do you plateau, why you plateau, and then what the adjustment should be. And they're not the same. And that there's a big difference between what might theoretically get the best response and what is feasible for your lifestyle, your environmental factors and how well you can recover right now and what's sustainable. So those things are going to all come together in a different combination for each individual to result in some different outcome. So I think that is just, it's tough for people. So it's not about necessarily leniency or being more specific. It's helping people understand the differences. And if you're new to the game, you probably don't need a super individualized approach. Everything's going to work. So it probably makes sense to start with the low end of the volume recommendations and focus on quality motor skill acquisition. Because what you don't want to do is tell someone who's overwhelmed by all the information that's out there, who's new to lifting, hey, you can do whatever you want, because that is more overwhelming. But if you do tell them, hey, I want you to do somewhere between 10 to 15 or 8 to 12 sets, and I want you to train at a 0 to 2 RIR, you don't want to make them think, and that's the way I should always train and the way everyone should train, and there's no exploration from here. That is the 10 Commandments, which is a natural thing that people do, and also that some people will give you on the internet for better or for worse.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, so it's again having that system in place to make sure you can make those adjustments and find what works for you. And I'm assuming this probably is something that may change over time as well too. It may not always be that way for you. It might change over time too. But again, having that system in place and going from there. And again, having maybe this large toolbox is nice, because then that allows you to, hey, if this isn't working, we can make some adjustments here to see if that works better for you there with that. Cool. One, I guess two kind of things here too. So I know you've said in the past, when you've done kind of higher volumes, you start to develop some tendonitis, elbow tendonitis, stuff like that. Is that something that's been, I know you said you're doing upwards of almost 40-ish, 30 to 40 sets from an arm perspective, if you count indirect sets. Any issues with that? Is there anything that's been helpful there from an elbow tendonitis standpoint or anything like that?
Yeah, it's fortunately subsided. And I think a big component to that is just making sure that the exercise selection you choose works well with your body. Through intelligent exercise selection and good use of like appropriate rep ranges, I can keep it at bay most of the time. And then if it starts to flare up a little bit, then I have some early kind of warning signs and I'm smart enough now to not ignore them and train through them. In my late 20s, I would be like, oh, that's not too bad. I can train through this and not adjust anything. And then the next week, I would still justify that, and then I'd be done. Oh my gosh, shit. Now, even though I make the adjustment, it's still debilitatingly painful. And just acknowledging too that sometimes I'm more pain sensitive if I got poor sleep or if I'm more stressed, and identifying that and not necessarily overcorrecting in those cases. But focusing on recovery is a huge component to it. Good exercise selection is another, and that's an ambiguous thing, and it's probably too challenging to get into in any kind of useful way. I'd have to be in the gym with someone and then look at what their needs are. But some of the tools that I do use when and if it crops up is I will shift to more neutral grip work on all of my pulling and all of my bicep work. And I will also implement higher rep ranges, so lower loads, and even potentially blood flow restriction training, so I can really lower the load down. It seems to be more impacted by load for me rather than necessarily the load and exercise selection, which kind of go hand in hand, versus the volume. So I've been able to accomplish, I think, yeah, if you add it all up, and most of it is indirect work. Like I said, I'm in the high 20s for sets on back and chest. So that's right there, all of the majority of my arm work, and then another 10 to 12 sets that are direct. Yeah, for all of my work, I can handle all that volume without it being an issue until I start to do dumb things as far as exercise execution or selection, or if I'm like, yeah, let's do the 4 to 6 rep range on my isolation work, then I have a much shorter runway before I have to intervene.
Yeah, so load overall is a big one there. And then what was, you said load, and what was exercise selection. So like for you, again, just finding, and again, like you said, we don't need to dive into what exercises, because like you said, that is very individual. But for you, it's just making sure you shy away from those ones that maybe you find irritating and stuff like that.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to just making sure that the line of pull lines up with where the joints are.
Yeah.
And you can have a lot more freedom to work with cables if you're not. People run into issues when they have like almost a cultural affectation towards certain lifts. I only want to do free weights. Okay, but you could potentially recreate that and line up the joint a little bit better with a cable, and you might not bother you. That's definitely an experience I've had.
Yeah, not being so, like you said, stuck in your head or stuck in your ways in terms of, again, hey, you have to use this machine, or hey, you have to use free weights or whatever it may be. Yeah, I found cables would be super helpful and a nice thing to implement. But yeah, just messing around with exercise selection. And like you said, lining up the pull there, making sure that's in a good spot, and just trial and error. And like you said, because I do the same thing when that starts to flare up. So, I'll be fine. I'm going to be good. And the next 2 to 3 weeks later, man, your freaking elbows are barking at you and everything like that. And then everything's impacted at that point. Cool. Yeah. Really love talking to you about your training. It always leads to a ton of other stuff that we chat about. A couple things I really wanted to bring you on today to talk about your muscle and strength pyramid. So you wrote these. I think you said this is the third edition now, right? That you'll be redoing here shortly. So again, if you haven't, make sure you check these out. They're just a fundamental from a nutrition and training perspective. So definitely make sure you check those out. But I just want to talk to you about some potential changes that you were, or think not necessarily changes, but I guess things maybe you're adding in, or maybe even some changes that you've made from the second to third edition from a training and nutrition perspective. We can start with either one. Well, I guess we'll just start with training there, and just curious to hear some big changes and things that maybe you rethought and stuff like that from the last edition.
Yeah, one of the big ones is I'm actually considering from the second level. So it goes adherence, then it goes volume, intensity, and frequency of, I will still discuss it in this chapter, but I don't know that I want to have the word frequency is actually on that level of the pyramid and just have it be volume and intensity. Because those are essentially the dose. And we've got really solid data to indicate that manipulating the dose, either the volume or the intensity, depending on how you define it, which is probably more usefully defined as effort and proximity to failure for hypertrophy, and more usefully defined as load if the goal is strength. Seeing that when you control for load and when you control for effort and when you control for volume, manipulations and frequency are far less important. We have like multiple meta-analyses on that for both strength and hypertrophy. So I think in the real world, you still have to acknowledge that manipulating frequency is a great way to manipulate, or at least it impacts load, volume, and effort. So being aware of that is very important, but I don't know that I will actually have it on the pyramid infographic, if you will. So that's a pretty big change. It's the first time I've actually modified the pyramid itself rather than the content within each one since the original videos in 2013 that I did on my Samsung S3. That's a big one. Another big one kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, is I want to be really intentional and specific in my language about what is the minimum effective dose, and I do mean effective. What do you need to see measurable progress versus what is the dose that might maximize the rate of progress? The difference between those and the sustainability, the feasibility, and then when would you choose one versus the other? Because I think some people really struggle with this. And a lot of the arguments you see online are generally people talking across each other. Someone is interested in actually competing in bodybuilding and they're very happy to do an unbalanced ROI, and someone is watching that, wants to follow it, and is really frustrated because, God, I don't have the time. How do people do this? And I'm not really seeing a noticeable benefit. And it's, yeah, you can get 80% of that progress doing 1/3 of the work, right? And also just knowing that you can even do less than that to hold the line. If you're traveling on vacation, or if you're ill, or you have an injury, or if you just got a new job, or if you're in a really tough semester, or you're prepping for exams, or your kids are going into a new phase of their life, or whatever, knowing that you can do a very abbreviated version of that and see no regression, I think is something that is missed a lot of the times. And those are the typical critiques of the higher volume studies or content. I think it's a mismatch between the content creator and the consumer, saying that you might be able to optimize your gains by doing more than 20 plus sets based on a few studies. Whether that is generalizable to all data remains to be seen. That really pisses some people off because they think it's going to mislead more of your general population lifter. And it's true. And we shouldn't be like shying away from reality or truth, but we do need to put it into context. So I want to do a lot of work to differentiate between a maintenance dose, an effective dose, and an optimized dose, and when each one is and isn't appropriate and for whom. So that's a big thing that'll also change in that chapter, besides de-emphasizing frequency. And yeah, some of the instruction around proximity to failure, I think, will also be helpful now that we have a little more clarity around how it interacts with load from the Robinson meta-regression for hypertrophy, where if you're lifting heavy enough, you probably don't need to worry about how close to failure you are. And that going close to failure does seem to have a pretty reliable dose response where, hey, maybe you should push it a little closer. So those things will be changed. And then there will be a fair bit around exercise selection technique to focus not just on, hey, full range of motion is good, but why? Because it includes that lengthened portion. And then in cases where you have exercises that are traditional but aren't great in terms of where they're hard at the shortened position rather than the lengthened position for the muscle group, and how that might modify things. A very simple thing to do is push it to failure on back work because you're probably going to have a whole lot left in that lengthened position. And if you get closer and closer to failure, or if you redefine the point of failure by doing 2/3 of the rep versus the whole thing and touching your chest and being super strict, you'll probably get a more similar stimulus to a movement like a press or a quad exercise that are typically harder in that lengthened position anyway. So some of this stuff around muscle length and its interaction with tension and exercise selection and technique will be added throughout as well. So people have a better, more nuanced understanding of why full range of motion is important and what aspect of full range of motion is important. And then finally, another thing that I'm adding is more guidance and instruction around how to use RPE to auto-regulate training, especially for powerlifters, as a way of monitoring progress in their 1RM over time with diagnostic singles, if you will, and how to adjust training based upon their response. And also some time-saving techniques on the bodybuilding side of things around rest, pause, and drop sets and how those can be incorporated and how would you compare those versus straight sets. And that kind of will round out most of the changes for the most part.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like, again, just taking into consideration all the kind of research that's come out in the last, when was the last edition of the?
Yeah, I wrote them at the very end of 2018.
Okay.
So,
So
yeah.
about 6 years now at that point, and a lot happens in that period of time. So yeah, cool. So frequency, again, something where you're just de-emphasizing it again. I think there was another study that recently came out that kind of split versus full body routine. I don't know if that was another thing that kind of maybe swayed your mind on that, but yeah, again, basically just saying, hey, like you said, frequency plays a role, but at the end of the day, like you said, your intensity and the volume is going to be much, much bigger there with that. And then obviously long muscle length training, how I'm sure you get asked that probably daily at this point now in terms of that. So obviously a hot topic. So another thing there with that. So cool. Just update to that. And again, taking into consideration all the research that's come out there with that. And then what about on the nutrition side of things?
The nutrition side, a pretty large change that I want to make is how I recommend macronutrients and calories together. I think if are familiar with my recommendations, I often suggest having ranges for the macros and then, like for different goals, being more precise with your measurements, which I think is still an important philosophy, but they're relatively arbitrary. We make those cutoffs. The idea of I want to be within plus or minus 5 or 10 grams for my macros as best. Pretty good is calories and then protein, and then okay is just calories, depending upon your goal, the situation you're in, whether you're traveling, you have access to a scale. And I think that's a perfectly fine heuristic, but something that I've found increasingly hard to justify as more and more data came out showing that for many goals, especially for lifters, the specific amount of carbohydrates and fats are less important so long as calories are in place and protein is in place. And that so long as you're not going all the way to very low fat intakes, you can play around with distribution a fair bit. And thinking about, okay, how would I use that information to give more flexibility and customization to every individual, considering I've got people reading my books in Japanese, Chinese, Italian, Spanish, and that people are going to implement these recommendations all over the world. And a lot of their personal preferences and food choices are going to vary substantially. So one way to look at this is you can make an isocaloric exchange of 20 grams of fat for 45 grams of carbohydrates. And in most cases, that's not going to make much of a difference if calories and protein are matched. I have a really tough time justifying why 80 grams of fat and 300 grams of carbs is different for someone versus 60 grams of fat and 345 grams of carbohydrates. I think in 99% of people, at most, it would just be personal preference. Both hit probably functional minimums in all cases for almost all goals, unless you're a really big person. So why do I have someone calculating their macros and fats and worrying about that if I can alleviate that? So the change in the way I plan on recommending it is actually providing people different functional minimums for each one of the intakes. So when you're cutting or when you're gaining, and whether you're going through a really harsh temporary phase of digging on, say, contest prep versus a more traditional fat loss diet, what would be the minimum intake I'd recommend for each one of the macros? So like your basement bottom level that you ever might want to hit is 20 to 30 grams of fat per day if you're going through a harsh digging phase and you're 8 weeks out from a bodybuilding show. But if you're cutting to something much more sustainable, maybe you'd never go below 40 to 50 or 50 to 60, right? That really just comes down to what is going to be sufficient to get all your essential fatty acids and to actually be able to use fat soluble vitamins versus what's going to be better from a health and longevity perspective and a adherence perspective, and how long is each one of those periods going to last. So having a couple different functional minimums enter different scenarios as your fat intake. Similarly, for carbs, you might have a functional minimum in the off season where it's, yeah, if you probably don't want to go below 3 grams per kilogram for something like that. But then during a cut where you're having to rob Peter to pay Paul, you go, okay, let's just keep you out of the ketogenic range, more than 1 gram per kilogram. And then for protein, it might be a little bit different, where we have some indication that you might benefit from higher protein intakes while cutting. But in the off season, you've got such an energy surplus, you're higher in body fat, so long as you're at 1.6 grams per kg as a lower threshold, but still recognizing that it being at 1.4, 1.5, or 1.3 even is still a sufficient thing, like the whole volume recommendation. I want to make that clear too. It's not like everything falls off a cliff when you hit 1.59 grams per kilogram of protein, but where do we seem to optimize and maximize that dose? It's the 1.6 or higher in a surplus. But if you're lean and if you're dieting, maybe perhaps it would be a good idea to be a little bit higher. And then we can just go, okay, so here are your calories and here's your minimum intake for carbs, fat, and protein. And once you've met your minimum intake for carbs, fat, and protein, you have a ton of flexibility. Do what you want. And I think that provides even more flexibility and in more cases and scenarios than just having a macro target that you're allowed to deviate 10 grams somewhere. So you get plus or minus 100 calories on your calorie target that you deviate on a day-to-day basis and then hit your minimum intake of carbs, fat, and protein. And now you're not doing weird shit like going, should I have a tablespoon of olive oil at 10 p.m. to hit my macros? And I think that's going to result in better relationships with food and just less head scratching and scrolling through MyFitnessPal. So that's one of the bigger changes. And then perhaps an update on intermittent fasting and protein distribution and a better understanding of why does some of the acute mechanistic data on muscle protein synthesis, which would make you think you wanted a higher, at least protein feeding frequency, compared to the actual outcomes that we see in applied studies, where we really don't have any hard data showing that a meal frequency of any more than 3 times per day seems to benefit hypertrophy or fat loss. So what's the disconnect? And for example, some of the research that recently came out by Jorn Trommelen, where they compared whole body protein synthesis, muscle protein synthesis, and oxidation rates when having like a bolus of 100 grams of protein versus say 30 or 40, I think is really telling. And we can connect some of those dots and I can explain to people why we have these theoretically optimal dosing guidelines for say leucine or protein that don't play out in the real world, why and what that actually means as far as how you should set up your meal frequency for different goals. And what are the bounds of something like a time restricted feeding / intermittent fasting approach? And how do you, if you want to use that approach, how do you do it without sacrificing anything? So I think some of that will round that out, and then a little more of a nuanced discussion around what I would call diet periodization. So where are we at with the data on refeeds and diet breaks? What is it likely to benefit? What do we not know yet? Because that was a more speculative section of nutrient timing in the pyramids. And now we actually have 3 studies on diet breaks, 4 studies arguably, where we can be a little more explicit as far as what the potential benefits are and less speculative.
And then two off that, I have a couple questions on the first one you mentioned too, but weight gain as well too. Is that something that your recent study has altered that as well too in terms of what you put in there? Or is that kind of largely the same as what it was previously?
It's solidified it is what it has done. I'm a lot more confident in the recommendations that existed, but I do think I can probably make it more simpler. I can make it simpler related to why might you see different rates of weight gain at different times and the energy cost of building muscle and the energy value of muscle and some of the stuff we talked about earlier related to why you might see faster weight gain when you're making leaner gains. That will be in there. Oh, and then one other final thing that will also be a big change in the pyramids is the supplement section is going to be a fair bit more conservative, fewer recommendations, and a big piece on how often supplements tend to be contaminated and the startlingly high rates and what you should do about it in terms of third-party testing and what do you stand to gain in being experimental in your supplement buying versus what do you stand to lose.
So on the first one there about like the hitting the more so the minimums, right? I think that's awesome because then like you said, like now you don't have people like trying to, like you said, make these weird meals, which it's okay. We're trying to get away from, we're trying to give people more flexibility to be like less stressed about what they're eating. And then they end up just being way more stressed and like you said, leading to poor relationships. So I love the minimums and really focusing on like calories and protein. And then like you said, having minimums. I guess my question off that is, are you basing that kind of off of like research? Or are you basing that off of your you personally or working with clients, or is it just a combination of evidence-based, like a combination of all of them there?
Ultimately, it is a combination of it, but we do have pretty good research now. Especially if you piece together some dots from other areas, Dr. Trexler did a great job in mass, for example, figuring out where do we think these functional minimums for fat intake are, which was the challenge. And I think we do have reasonable guidelines for minimum intakes in carbohydrates based upon studies on ketogenic diets in strength athletes, and also some data that came out that I was a part of, a meta-analysis by my PhD student, Andrew King, showing that it seems to be in certain cases you get a little benefit as far as peri-workout carbohydrate feeding for the total amount of volume you can accomplish. What are some functional, realistic minimums that would allow you to do that without having a diet that is just weird or largely devoid of carbohydrates at other times of the day? I think you can absolutely make very strong empirical claims as to where some of these minimums come from, especially for protein and to a lesser degree, but pretty clearly for fat and carbohydrates, in my opinion. And then you just need to modify it for context. And the coaching experience is very helpful because the bounds of what does someone with a really low energy expenditure and therefore energy requirement have versus high, and what do certain gram per kilogram recommendations result in as far as real world diets, which I think you need to for people, because people don't eat macros, they eat diets, right? You have to think about what does that look like when you put it into the real world. And that's actually something else I'll be covering, is more the qualitative aspect of nutrition, not just focusing on the grams per kilogram, but what might your plate look like? What should your meal structure for the day look like? And how important is it to actually just set up a bit of structure? And structure is not just hitting three numbers on a day-to-day basis. In fact, you can be quite unstructured if that's the only anchor you have to the way you do things, and it can lead to poor adherence and worse outcomes in terms of appetite regulation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad to hear that. And just like you said, these minimums, like at that point, just seeing where it falls, giving the client that ability to just let them go off preference, and then just basically look at their biofeedback, how they're feeling, and then adjust it if need be. But I'm sure you feel this way too. It's really hard unless you're really going out of your way to be really off on either carbohydrates or fats. Like you really have to go out of your way. So it's like you end up not even having to worry about it unless, again, they're having some sort of like symptoms, and then you can dive into it and make those adjustments there to it if need be. Cool. Yeah. So when is the third edition coming out?
The goal is to get them out before the end of the year, but that could be like December. It's probably later rather than sooner. So I would say no earlier than fourth quarter. And I'm not going to promise, but most likely 2024.
You already promised it. We're going
Yeah.
to hold you to it. So if I don't hear it, I'll play this clip for you and be like, hey, you got to get it out by December.
I will be held to it. Come knock on my door, assault me, throw tomatoes.
I'll travel across the world just to do that. Cool. So just real quick before I let you go, I just want to get your thoughts on two recent studies that came out. I know we're close here on time. Just wanted to briefly get your thoughts on it. So the first was the lengthened kind of supersets and adding the partials in at the end. And I'm pretty sure I think Larson was the main guy on that. I think my Wolf was also in it. Yeah, just your general thoughts. Does this change anything for you? Have you been implementing this type of stuff into your training or anything like that?
I think it's a great proof of principle. This is a great example of how evidence-based practice should work, in my opinion. You understand a concept based on findings, but you are not rigidly adhering to the way it was implemented in the study itself. And you go, okay, how can I use this information to then do something effective in the literature? For example, where you saw this playing out the most over the last years is that, oh, okay, we see the lengthened position is better. And we don't even have this from lengthened partial studies. We had it before that. We had it from comparing the seated hamstring curl to the lying hamstring curl, right? We had this from comparing overhead tricep extensions to tricep pushdowns. We have this from isometric studies at longer muscle lengths for shorter muscle lengths. It's been very clear for a while now that being at a longer muscle length seems to provide an additional stimulus for hypertrophy. And then if you think about that and you go, okay, cool. Oh, wow. So all the back work we're doing and why we seem to have this epidemic of people struggling to get bigger lats while they're doing pretty well in their quads and their pressing musculature, that might be part of it. And people noticing that, yeah, actually, back work is really hard in the shortened position. And it's not a real pull-up unless you get your chin over the bar, but we're exerting all this effort to actually get the shortened position emphasized. Where people started implementing this in the complete absence of studies was potentially going past failure and doing basically reverse drop sets, where one example that Kasim, to give a shout out to him, probably the first time I saw it, is someone doing rows, full range of motion, And then once you can no longer do full range of motion rows, you increase the weight and then go to doing just the range you can do with a higher load to account for that strength curve or that biomechanical difference. And we just don't have any studies that look at back hypertrophy because it's very challenging to chuck your lat in an MRI or to isolate back muscles in a DEXA and even getting muscle thickness measurements there. It's difficult to have a consistent set of bony landmarks to go, right, we're measuring this portion of the lat. That's hopefully going to change in the future. We're extrapolating from data on triceps, hamstrings, quadriceps, etc., to other muscle groups. That's how evidence-based practice should work. You take what should be a generalizable principle and you apply it into practice. And then it gets kicked back into the research and we go, okay, cool. How are you guys doing this in the trenches? Let us take a look at that. And I think that's exactly what Larson did. It's taking a look at the idea of going, I'm going to go to failure at full range, and then I'm going to continue doing partial range and seeing that it actually was effective. And that makes sense, right? It helps us understand the principle. If it didn't go that way, it would be interesting. We'd have to figure out why, and it would take us back to the drawing board. And that does indeed happen, which is why you need this interplay of concepts being applied in practice a little bit different than the research, but based on the research, and then the research being updated to then reflect what's being done in practice to give us a better and better understanding of something so we can implement the tool more precisely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting study, and it does give more direct empirical support to the concept of doing like a lengthened partial superset, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, I love it.
Yeah, no, I just want to get your thoughts on it, and it's always good to hear from somebody who's in the research, just get their thoughts on it and whatnot. So it sounds like this is just something that's probably going to lead to more kind of research around this area, essentially. Like you said, proof of kind of concept essentially with it, or proof of, right? Yeah. Cool. And then the second one was the leg extension one. I think the same group as well, too, how they lean back. Is that something that you've implemented or anything like that? Is that something that you will implement, or yeah?
It is something I'm currently doing. And I think this is also a helpful study because sometimes when you try to manipulate things around a concept, if you don't fully understand the anatomy involved, you can make errors. One thing I initially did when I was trying to get out of hip flexion on a leg extension to get more of a lengthened position for the rectus femoris, which crosses the hip, was I actually set up like a block that brought my hips off the pad a little bit. And that you probably don't want to do. So if you're actually sitting on a pad to get into hip extension, as your hips rise, you're reducing the number of degrees of knee flexion, if you think about it, right? So ideally, you'd just be able to just lay down flat and do a leg extension so that the amount of rotation about the knee stays the same. But you can't do that. So the compromise here, instead of elevating your hips so that you're into extension, but then reducing the range of motion about the knee, which is defeating the purpose, you might get a little more stretch on the rec fem, but now you're reducing the range of motion and you're coming out of the lengthened position for all of the other heads of the quadriceps and maybe the rec fem as well. You're trading 6 of one, half dozen the other. If you do that, is okay, then how do I increase hip extension, reduce the amount of hip flexion without changing knee flexion? And the really simple answer is put the seat all the way back and just lean back into it, right? Maybe a little less comfortable, but it's typically not too bad. Most people seem fine with it. It's a little harder depending upon how long your femurs are and how tall you are. Some people need to be back that far. And as a 6-foot guy, kind of normalish length femurs, I don't get as much out of it as some other people do. But I am definitely noticing that I can the better compromise that way. And then I'll even put a foam pad in front of assuming the machine doesn't give me enough range on its own, but most leg extensions, you can get a little more range if you put a foam pad in front of your shins and get a few more inches of range of motion. So what I do is I set leg extension all the way back, foam pad in front of my shins, and then I'm able to get a replicated position from that study. So the study, simply put, it just compared being in a normal quote unquote position on a leg extension machine to making it better, leaning back and seeing substantially greater rec fem hypertrophy, which makes a ton of sense based upon all the other stuff we saw. And just if anyone doesn't understand, the rectus femoris is both a hip flexor and a knee extensor. It crosses the hip. So it is lengthened when you're in hip extension. It is shortened when you're in hip flexion. So the typical position on a seated leg extension is the rec fem is in a shortened position, which is unfortunate because the whole reason from a bodybuilding perspective we're doing a leg extension is that the rec fem is really not trained when you're doing simultaneous knee and hip extension, like in a squat, a leg press, a hack squat, or a lunge, because it would be counteracting the glutes and the action they're doing of hip extension. So you see relatively minimal growth in both the hamstrings and the rec in squats, and we've seen that in multiple studies. So you need to do some isolation work to round that out. But the main isolation exercise that people choose for the rec fem is a seated leg extension, which shortens it, even though it allows us to train. And we see way better response just leaning back in a leg extension, which is great. It's more confirmation that indeed there is something important about making sure that a muscle is in a more lengthened position when you're having a high exposure of tension to it to enhance the stimulus.
Yeah, and on the leg extension, real quick, this is one that like was poo-pooed on for a while. I feel like where it's like, hey, you just need a back squat. Yeah, again, like you said, now you're not training that rec fem, so you want to make sure you add this in. I actually had a conversation with somebody how like they have the benches, like the at-home benches, and it has like the leg extension there.
Yes.
It's actually now it's got a really good use because now you can lay back as far as you want. Whereas before it was probably an extension, but now it's money now based on this study. So maybe we'll see more machines that allow for this because I do find that some of them can be a challenge to get set up, like you said there, and it might be a little uncomfortable. So maybe this will help people design these machines a little bit differently. And I know at N1 they have it, Cass rigged it to where you could really lean back. And when I was at the practical, I did that. Man, that really does make a huge difference. Cool. Yeah, I love seeing these studies come out. I'm sure there's going to be more and more around this. Eric, really appreciate your time, man. Always good catching up with you, and can't wait to see how the rest of your massing phase goes. And I'm sure we'll catch up again, and there'll be more research we can talk about and more hot topics as well too. And then hopefully we'll be closer to the muscle and strength pyramids. But before I let you go, anywhere where you want to lead the audience to, or anything coming out on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd recommend people check out Mass Research Review. We're going to be covering some of these specific studies in the July issue, or even discussing them in our new live journal club stuff that Dr. Mike Zerdos runs for subscribers. So if you want to get an even deeper look into the kind of post-failure lengthened partial study, definitely are joining Mass. Or if you just want to ask questions about it live with us, definitely check out Mass Research Review on YouTube, where anyone, even non-subscribers, can join us every week, hosted by Dr. Trexler, and one of the other three Mass contributors will be on there with him answering questions. So yeah, just check out those two sources if you're interested. And then if you want to know more about my personal training, then definitely check out the Team 3DMJ YouTube channel.
Awesome. Yeah, Mass Office Hours has been great. And again, free resource as well too, but Mass is great as well. So awesome, Eric. Really appreciate your time. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, sir.